On today's video, we're painting Templars. Painting banners is great fun, and it's a great way to sort of flex your hobby muscles and see just what you can do. On this banner, we're going to do two different kinds of non-metallic metal, something I like to call faux SL, and even more. We're going to go for some antique bone, and it's going to look really, really cool by the time it's done. There will be some airbrushing, which you can skip and you can just use glazes for if you want to, but it's easier if you've got one to help with the OSL, and we've got a lot of glazing and brushwork to do with all of the non-metallic metals. If you're unsure how to thin your paint properly for glazes, then check out this handy video I made a long time ago now that will really help you out, and then you can get started. Okay, so for the sword, you're going to need some Thamar Black, Eldritch, and Sickly Skin. For the flames, you're going to need Thamar Black, Kato Red base, Flashgate Shadow, Meneth White Highlight, and Intense Red. And then finally, you're going to need some Rhinox Hide, Flashgate Shadow, Eyeshadow, more Meneth White Highlight, and Nagaroth Night for the gold. Okay, we're kicking things off with a meep, but also my favourite way of painting black. I'm using some Secret Weapon Miniatures Tire Black for a base coat. If you can't find it because it has been discontinued, just take some Inky by Darkness and some black, mix the two together, and you'll be kind of close enough. Once you've got your base coat down of that, add in some Gravedigger Denim, and then later some Administratum Grey for your highlights. Don't worry if you go a little bit too far with these, just take some black in the airbrush and just bring back some of the shadows should you feel you need to. It's okay to go back and forth when working on your volumes and highlights and so on. Next step is to start blocking in all the reds. We think some Thamar Black, some Kato Red base, mix those 1 to 3, and we'll start painting everything that needs to be red. That's the candles at the top and the flames at the bottom. Once that's done, we're going to put the same mix in the airbrush, and we'll start to just fuzz over the outside edges of those, as well as getting a nice smooth base coat on our surface. We want to get the flames looking like they have a sort of faux SL kind of effect over a black field in the background, rather than a red field. I just think this would look better on the miniature. Then start adding in more and more red until you end up with pure Kato Red. Keep doing exactly the same thing, fuzzing the outside a little bit, building up a little glow in the background, and bringing our flames up in volume. Keep working up towards some Flashgate Yellow by adding in more and more passes of that, until you've got something that's nice and bright and yellow. And then finally start adding in some Meneth White Highlight or something very bright and kind of a nice ivory to just lift that yellow up even further. At this stage, you want to keep things kind of tight in. You want to retain a lot of the orange warmth that you get from the flames, because without it, it looks kind of weird. I've done a lot of flames now, and I've found that if you stay within the orange area of the spectrum and just put the highest highs out to yellow and the lowest lows out to red, it works reasonably well. So try and keep that in mind. With every step though, fuzz out the background till you end up with something like that that's going to give you that nice little glowing effect around the flames. Alright, so once we've got the base of all of our flames and everything else down, it's time to start working on the bones and the script. We want to keep these two separate when you look at the miniature, but we're going to start them off with the same base coat. By use of different shades and different highlight methods, we're going to get a good sense of separation between the two. You're probably going to need 2 coats of that, so take your time, get a nice foundation. For all of the scroll work, using some Dark Oath Flesh contrast paint. I've started using this thinned right down with water recently because I find that it gives a really nice colour and hue to the scroll work, as well as, of course, giving that slight little benefit of a highlight to it. For the skeletal parts, you're adding some Army Petter green tone thinned to a wash with just water, and you probably want to do 2 passes with this. After the first one, it wasn't quite enough, so we went back on again with a slightly thicker pass. Do go in and wick away anything that's like really hanging out in the creases though. You don't want big pools of it. Then we can start highlighting. For our scroll, we're using Meneth White base thin slightly with water and start working up the volumes of the scroll, but also start to get into the lettering. We kind of want about the top 2/3 of this to be filled with a highlight. As you can see here, it's looking pretty good. By the time we get our second highlight on, which is adding some Meneth White Highlight, we're starting to underline some of the letters and really make those stand out on the large bit of script work in the middle here. It's worth taking your time, make sure your paint is nice and thin, but if you go into any of the creases where the letters are, just take some more Dark Oath Flesh contrast paint, thin that down a little bit more, and then just trace in the letters to help tidy everything up. Honestly, don't panic about doing stuff like this. You've got a guide that you can use to sort of block all that text in anyway. For the bone, we're taking some green mixed in with that Menoth white, thinned quite well with water, and we're starting again to work on the volumes for the highlights of things rather than edges. By the time you've done that and the skeleton, you'll be a dab hand at it, and then you're ready to add in some more Menoth white highlight, once again thinned slightly, to just bring out those final highlights to it. If you feel there's not quite enough separation here, just come back in with some green, thin it down, glaze the bottom of the skulls, or maybe even just go into the recesses a little bit more to ensure that you've got something that stands out from everything else. At the end of the day, you can even mix in some browns and other things if you feel you need that separation. Just make sure it looks different from the cloth. For all of the black areas, we're taking some Tire Black, Administratum Grey, and Gravedigger, then the same mix we used in our airbrush right there at the end, and we're just getting a few edge highlights on. I wanted to make sure that the cloth itself looked voluminous and had all of the little highlights on around these creases, so I just took a few extra moments with it. I also made sure that the edging around the inside had the same highlight, and then we put some little bits of marking on the back. At the end of the day, the back of this banner is a little bit devoid of detail, so why not just take a few seconds to do a few things like this to really help it stand out when you're looking at it from back. Once all that's done, we're going to start glazing some Inktense Red. So this is basically a very, very, very high pigment red ink from scale 75. Now, if you can't find it, and it should be easy enough to find, you could just use some red ink thinned down with water. But what you're looking for is something that's very translucent, and it just changes the way the flames are. That little glow we've got in the background so it looks a lot bolder, a lot more red now by adding this to it. And I think this is a really key part of getting that faux SL that we did earlier on to really be dialed in and have the vibrancy and the power that you want it to have. So the sword on this banner really stands out, and it does so for a very large reason. We've got a very warm colour palette here on the banner. We've got lots of bone colours, the red to the yellow, obviously bringing that hot heat for the flame. Now we're going to put on something that's very, very, very cool, and that's going to bring a massive contrast, really switch up what we've got going on. First thing we need to do is give ourselves a nice base coat for all of this. When you're doing any kind of like really sort of finicky blending, always best to start from a neutral colour. So we base coat everything black. Now, when you're painting this sword, there's a couple of ways that you could do it. You could try wet blending, you could do it with the airbrush, but what we're going to do today is layered blending. What we're really going to be doing is layered blending using glazes. All this stuff is just artist speak for putting down one coat of paint on top of another coat of paint on top of another coat of paint, and each of these coat of paints being incrementally smaller than the last. We're going to make sure that each coat of paint is also very, very, very thin. That's our glaze element of this. So we're going to take glazes and we're going to start building up the highlights that we want on our sword. We're going to go for a very simple transition on this blade to help keep things moving reasonably quickly. And you go light to dark on one side and dark to light on the other side. So we have that nice crossover, gives a lot of interest because it brings high contrast. So as the layers go on, all we're doing is taking a little more eldritch and mixing that in with our black. You want to make sure you only put in a small amount, otherwise you'll increase the difference, the step from first one to the next one to the next one and so on by too much. Make sure it's thinned reasonably well with water. You want to get that to a glaze consistency and don't overload your brush. If you do, you'll find you end up with tide marks on the surface, and we want a really smooth, clean blend across the surface of our blade. Always work from the point of least impact to the point of most impact on the miniature as well. Eventually we reached the point where it was just eldritch that we were glazing onto the miniature, and this is where you start adding in your next colour, the sickly skin. At this stage, only a small amount of paint should be used because there's a massive change between the two, and even just a little of it will change the colour that we're working with dramatically. But now, instead of doing quite large, broad stroke glazes, what we want to do is start working much more towards the edges. This is that glint of light that's appearing on our sword, and so we need to put this where you'd see that light. So as well as getting into the top and the bottom corners of the blade where we've got that transition moving to its brightest stage, also start getting in some of those edge highlights. For that, work around the edge of the sword. You're sort of boxing it in without just drawing a box all around it. It still needs to have that little stylized hint for me. As you can see, we left the left hand side of the blade at the bottom entirely dark with no additional highlight from the sickly skin. This is because we want that to contrast really well with the skulls that are both in front and underneath it, and of course to the other side of the blade where the brightest point is. With any kind of non-metallic metal work, this is really important. Having the dark next to the light and having those two in contrast with each other really does bring the interest and captures the attention of the audience on your piece. So if you're liking the sword, why not hit that like button and subscribe to the video. We're about to go into non-metallic gold, so you better do it quick. Right, for the non-metallic gold, I'm going to start with a base of Rhinox hide. Now, I want to do something that's a little bit pale here, so kind of more along the lines of brass than actual gold, I guess. The reason behind that is because if we went with something that's very rich, yellowy, buttery kind of gold, it would kind of meld in a little bit with the flames, and I want that temperature contrast like we talked about earlier on through this. So starting with Rhinox hide as a base, once we've got that down, we start adding flash gitch yellow to it, and just like we did with the sword, it's a case of just adding a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and keeping your layers nice and thin all the way through. With regards to highlight placement, I chose to make the sort of upper, more external parts of each of the wings the brightest point for each one of those feathers. So as you can see here from the highlights, we're just blocking those in, making sure we're getting that smooth progression of brown up to yellow. Again, just like before, work from the position of least to most impact on the miniature and keep going until you're very happy you've got a nice bright yellow as you finish. Certainly by the time you're putting on pretty much just pure flash gitch yellow, you're ready to start moving on and getting something brighter going through. So in this case, the next brightest thing that we've got is some Vallejo Ice Yellow. This is a nice little stepping stone between yellow and something like our next color, for instance, Menoth White Highlight. This is going to help us get a little bit closer to where we want without the risk of taking too much of a step change. By doing this, we're keeping our blend relatively consistent and we're just taking out a little bit of risk. If you don't have it, don't worry, just be careful adding in the Menoth White Highlight. Keep building this up until you're happy you've got something that's nice and bright, but stop just short of where you want to be. What we're going to do is we're going to take some Naggaroth Night, thin that down, and do a recessed shade into all of this. Now, by doing this, we're going to sharpen up a lot of our NMM. It's going to help smooth out some of those blends as well. And if we look at both sides side by side, you see the left side looks a lot crisper and cleaner because we've done that. So make sure you do this step because it really does help to bring a lot of that sort of fidelity to your blends. Lastly, we're going to take some more Menoth White Highlight, thin that down, add it to the mix, and we're going to get a nice final crisp peak highlight on all of those feathers. Once we're done, we're going to be ending up with something that looks really good as far as I'm concerned. Contrasts very well with the flames below, and again, looks good around that blade. So once all the gold's done, it's time to start working on the flames. And essentially all we're doing is taking some Kador Red base and some Flash Gitch Yellow and making a nice warm but bright orange for our first highlight. What we're going to do is add more and more yellow into this as we go before finally adding in a little bit of that Menoth White Highlight for a final highlight to keep our flames looking nice and hot. Now, if you're enjoying this video and you've already hit that like and subscribe button, why don't you come on over to Twitch where you can watch me live 4 times a week where we can answer questions that you've got in person, or you can just see what I'm working on in real time. If you're really enjoying the video, I even got a Patreon campaign where you can get more videos like this every other week, as well as full written guides on everything that we do. Links to both of those are in the description below, and hopefully we'll see you guys in the streams. As you can see, adding that last highlight of Menoth White really helps bring out those flames. And with the slight glow we've got in the background for that faux cell, really just brings out the whole banner and gives it a quite undeniable sort of attention-grabbing bit of detail to it. Lastly, we're just going to paint the stars. We're going on with some rust grey to form the base coat, mixing that in about 50-50 with some Morrow White from P3 for a first highlight, and then the last highlight we're just putting a little bit of white in both the centre of the star and the tips on each of the 4 extremes. That's pretty much it. If you want to see how we did the candles, it's basically the same as we did for the flames, so honestly no real reason to show that, but maybe we'll put them in another video if you guys comment and ask for it enough. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I really hope you've enjoyed this. I had great fun painting all of these Black Templar characters. There might even be a cheeky video on Helbrecht at some point. So hit the bell button and stay tuned for notifications for that. Once again, thank you for watching, and I do hope to see you all on Twitch. Take care, everyone. Peace out.